It's a new day in Israel where, for the first time in 12 years, a new government was sworn in hours ago. Longtime Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is officially out after the country's legislature supported a coalition government made up of his opponents in a razor-thin 59-60 vote yesterday, bringing an end to a two-year stalemate of deadlocked elections, which coincided with a corruption trial against Netanyahu. The new majority isn't exactly a sea change. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and several other coalition members are former allies of the ousted leader who largely agree with him on most policy issues. One possible difference, Israel's relationship with the U.S., which Netanyahu highlighted after yesterday's vote, speaking in both English and Hebrew.
We'll be back soon. We'll be back.
Prime Minister in Israel must be able to say no to the President of the US in topics that are threats to our existence.
For his part, President Joe Biden is hoping for a friendlier relationship this time around, saying in a statement, quote, "I look forward to working with Prime Minister Bennett to strengthen all aspects of the close and enduring relationship between our two nations. My administration is fully committed to working with the new Israeli government to advance security, stability, and peace for Israelis, Palestinians, and people throughout the broader region." Joining me to discuss are Jeremy Burton, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston, and Leila Farsakh, Chair of the Political Science Department at UMass Boston and author of The Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and Occupation. Welcome to both of you. Jeremy, I want to start with you first because I've been spending a lot of time trying to explain this process of how a new prime minister was chosen, and I'm not going to put that burden on you completely, but I do want you to help us point out that the coalition formed isn't really a block of people that have much in common, except that they all wanted Netanyahu out. Is that a good assessment?
Well, thank you, Sue, for having me on. And yes, I do agree that one element of how this coalition came together is a broad range of factions and a broad range of people across the spectrum in Israeli politics wanting a change in leadership. And I do think it is a sea change. This is the most diverse government in the history of the state of Israel. It brings the far left of Israeli society, Meretz, back into government for the first time in 20 years. It is the first government in the history of the state of Israel that has an Islamist party as a signed member of the coalition. It's frankly the first government outside of the Islamic world that has a Islamist government party within the government. And yes, it also has those on the right, those who in some ways agree and have been supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies in the past. But even for those parties, it is a sea change in how they understand the relationship with the United States. And I think that's going to be a critical change going forward, which we saw already yesterday when senior leaders of the American government were already in conversation with the new ministers within hours after the seating of the government.
Professor, one of the challenges here as Netanyahu leaves the stage is he's not necessarily leaving the stage as one would expect. He's leaving the stage in a really Trumpist kind of way, already calling that there's the greatest election fraud in the history of democracy, which I thought we're just living through right now, according to some. What's your take on the change? Is it as big a deal, and have we seen the last of Netanyahu?
It is an important change. It's not a big deal because, in a sense, it is a continuation of Israel nationalist project, is a way of protecting Zionism and the state of Israel from the very far right, the way I see it, even though it has a right-wing coalition. I think we will not see the end of Netanyahu because Israel is also a parliamentary system. So Netanyahu now is in the opposition, and unlike in the US, when you are in the opposition, you're still very vivid, very alive. This is a very fragile national unity government, if you want. We don't know how long it will last. I think it is now put together and coalesce because of opposition to Netanyahu and wanting to restore a state budget, make a few things run that have not run for a few years. But the question will be, when will be the next crisis and how will they handle it? So I suspect it will last for the next 3 months. The question, will it last the full 4 years, I doubt it, but it will all, the devil is in the details and it's in the practice right now. So that's what I think. And the US-Israel relation is going to be very important in this regard, because this forthcoming approach of Biden will be very much welcomed as a sign of saying Israel is still a democratic country, wants to continue with the path and away from too much disruptive politics of Netanyahu.
Jeremy, I've been, watching Israel my entire life and talking about it, and I have to say that I think over the past 5 years or so, there's been a generational change of how both American Jews and American supporters of Israel and people who are actually living in Israel are viewing some of the challenges that Israel faces and how Netanyahu was facing them. Is it too much to expect that generational push is going to change some of the stances that Israel has, and also how our relationship, how the American relationship, will it improve, or will it stay kind of status quo the way it was a few years ago?
That's there's probably a very complicated answer to that question, because there are so many parts in that having to do with changes in the Israeli populace, in the Palestinian populace over time, in American populace, both Jewish and more broadly. It is certainly significant. This is a new generation prime minister for Israel. The first prime minister really who didn't grow up in the first years after the establishment of the state of Israel, and is really from a younger generation. It's also true that younger Israelis, their politics are shifting, and frankly, younger Americans, including young American Jews, and not just, I think it would be simplistic to say to the right or to the left, but in a variety of ways. In fact, I would say even more fractured and divided. And there's recent polling that suggests, certainly amongst young American Jews, that there is a more fractured polity both to the right and to the left. I think the significant thing, and I think this is an important thing not to do, is immediately assume this government will fall apart within 3 months, on literally 24 hours in, is to say, what is the change here? And the change is a generational change. The change is many, many parts of the society that is itself fractured, coming together and saying, we need to envision a world beyond what we've had for a long time. And, whatever one thinks about Prime Minister Netanyahu and his tenure, not only 12 years, but really over 25 years of dominating the scene there, it's fair to say that for a lot of Israelis, it became impossible to imagine a future, a world, a government beyond his. And even if this government is fragile, even if this government maybe doesn't make it through its entire tenure, Israelis are beginning to imagine a different kind of politics. And they're acting in different ways. The fact that someone like Naftali Bennett would team up with the Ram party to create a new government, that's a different way of thinking. And the future of Israel and the future for Israelis and Palestinians is going to require different ways of thinking by the people who actually live there on the ground. And I think that is a cause of hope, or possibility, at least for us in America, looking at it.
Yeah, Professor, we've seen over the past year, and obviously over the past month, people we didn't think would be speaking out, challenging Israeli policy here in America, progressive Democrats and certainly the younger Democrats who are pushing the Democratic Party to the left, but also are looking to push the rest of the world in a direction that they think is more equitable. Do you see this as an opportunity to make for Israel and Palestine to make a different sort of world together? And is that something that we see happening and moving, or is it going to be, as we said, this leadership is not that far away from Netanyahu's viewpoints on things?
Exactly. I think we'll have to wait and see. After all, Bennett was head of the Yeshiva Council of Settlements. So he is very much a supporter of the settlement movement in the West Bank, which compromises the creation of a Palestinian state. I think we have to understand this government also in the aftermath of the Gaza war, Israel's war on Gaza, which actually caused a big shift insofar as Israel is losing, some would argue, losing the diplomatic war, or the image of Israel has been in a way tainted because the war represented, again, the plight of the Palestinian, the unity of the Palestinian struggle. Palestinians have been the oppression in Gaza, but also in Jerusalem, also inside 48, the Palestinian cities of Israel. So I think it became clear to the world and also to Israeli, this new generation, that the Palestinian question is not dead. The Palestinians have right to equality and citizenship and statehood, and that this war problem cannot be shoveled by just compartmentalizing the Palestinians and putting them in fragmented areas. I think also this is what explains the entry of Ram into the coalition with Israel, is a way of saying of how the Palestinian citizens of Israel are reclaiming a certain agency and a certain holding Israel accountable to its own laws of being a liberal democracy. So that can be promised. So we have forces that are promising, especially the US can play a very important role with the Biden's administration emphasis on issues of equality, the link that people are making between Black Lives Matters and the Palestinian plight. So there is lots of connections that are becoming stronger and more evident. And it feels to me that Lapid, above all, is aware of the importance of winning also the media war or the diplomatic scene and showing that Israel is willing to pave a new path with the Palestinians. Will they do it? That's what I'm not too sure, because it is such a difficult coalition with very different opinions and objectives.
Jeremy, we've been hearing a lot this weekend of the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain as President Biden is at the G7 NATO meetings. And of course, it goes without saying we also have a special relationship with Israel. And I'm just wondering how you think that this new leadership and hopefully a renewed relationship with the United States may impact the region in general, and especially, Iran's role in the latest violence is certainly problematic and internationally problematic. What are you optimistic as well that things will continue to progress in a peaceful manner?
Well, the reason that the United States and Israel have a special relationship is because it has been enduring and it has been bipartisan. And if there's probably one thing that most American Jews, publicly or not so publicly, would say is a shared criticism of the prior government, has been that it made that relationship more partisan. And I think that's a thing that's broadly felt by a lot of people, both in the American Jewish community and the Democratic Party as well, which we see a lot of here in Massachusetts, is that under Prime Minister Netanyahu, that relationship maybe got a little tarnished by being tied up in some of the partisan fractures in our own society. There's no question that now Foreign Minister Lapid, who more than any one person is the architect of this new coalition and is himself an advocate for two states, sits in the center left of Israeli society, has cultivated long and serious relationships throughout his time in government with members of the Democratic Party on Capitol Hill. There's no question that people like now Transportation Minister Merav Michaeli, who's the leader of the Labor Party, the old party of the Israeli left, the party that has the deepest ties to the American Democratic Party going back to the Clinton years, has cultivated relationships. I was just watching over the weekend a video from when our Senator Elizabeth Warren was visiting the Knesset some 6 years ago in another yelling, screaming session. And member of Knesset Michaeli was the one who was greeting her and welcoming her and giving her the tour. So those relationships exist. And I think more than anything, the story today is that we are moving beyond the personality relationship that has dominated the last 12 years. And there are a lot more personalities. And yes, one can point at one member, the prime minister, who is a former aide to Netanyahu, who saw, frankly, how unhelpful Netanyahu's politics, both internally and diplomatically, were being unproductive. But this is a much broader coalition and change in personalities. And I think that's something to really focus on right now. And frankly, for anyone who cares about the future of the region and the future of all the region's people, is to invest in the success of those who are willing to engage in change for the sake of a more hopeful future.
Well, it's certainly hopeful that you can yell at each other and build a coalition and move forward. So maybe there's a model there for the United States. Jeremy Burton, Professor Leila Farsakh, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.